Hi, everyone. As you might know, my name's Tessa, and today I'll be introducing, for all intents and purposes, a practical great uncle to me, Bernat or Bernie Rosner. Bernat and my great grandfather became close friends during the Second World War. My great grandfather was instrumental in bringing Bernat to the United States. Bernat was born in 1932 in rural Hungary. His early life was shaped by rigorous discipline and of an Orthodox upbringing and a literate, sensitive mother. And overwhelmed by the Holocaust at age 12, he was the only member of his family to survive the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the other horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. Bernat came to the United States in 1948 at 16 and received his education at Cornell University and Harvard Law School. He spent 35 years in his career um, at the legal department of Safeway supermarket chain, and the last 10 years as company chief legal officer. After his retirement in 1994, him and his friend Fritz Tuback co-wrote an Uncommon Friendship book, which tells the unique story of two boys trapped on opposite sides of the Holocaust. I would just like to say how lucky we are to have a first-hand account of the cruel and inhuman acts that were inflicted on millions of people at this time. Although books and movies are great accounts of what happened, nothing can compare to like a first-hand account and a real story. Bernard, thank you so much for coming to talk with us today, and we really appreciate it.
Am I on?
Yes.
Thanks, Tessa, for the introduction. Thanks for Miss Cody and Miss M. Sarah for inviting me to talk to you today.
Oh,
and,
sorry.
and thank you all for taking the time to listen and hopefully give me a chance to answer your questions if you should have any, and if time permits. It's always a special occasion for me to be able to talk to young people. It's special for at least three reasons. First, you have to remember that when I landed on the train platform of the Auschwitz concentration camp and went through the nightmare of the Holocaust, I was just 12 years old, a couple of years younger than most of you are now. For that reason, I feel that young people like you can relate more strongly to what I went through and hopefully to draw some inspiration and support from my story when you will face crises and problems that at the time they hit you, they seem overwhelming. Second, I was among the youngest persons to survive the Holocaust, and in 2 weeks, I will be observing my 93rd birthday. The obvious conclusion is that there are few living survivors left, and there will be fewer and fewer as the years advance. This makes it, in my mind, a special occasion for both you and me. It is not very likely that too many students in the future will have a chance to hear the story of what happened during those terrible times from a person who actually lived through these events. I believe that is something special because it makes a big difference between reading something in a history book and hearing it from the person who actually experienced it. Third, you are the future. It will be up to you to hopefully make the world a better place and do your best to make sure that the horrors of the Holocaust and the other acts of inhumanity and terror that we have unfortunately witnessed since then do not just keep repeating themselves. The rest of what I have to say will consist of telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born in a smallish town by the name of Tub in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of those influences imbued me with an abiding love for books and learning. Anti-Semitism, and I understand that you have heard about the Holocaust, these terms like anti-Semitism, Nazi, you know what those things are. I'm going to assume you do. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied, harassed, and held up to contempt and hostility, not by any means by all of the non-Jewish population, but by a substantial segment of the community, many of whom were members or followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other racist parties. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of extermination as preached and practiced by Hitler and his thugs. And the anti-Semitic undercurrents running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not significantly affect our everyday life in my basically happy and tranquil childhood. I may say that that childhood was very different from yours. We did not have indoor plumbing. We didn't have any electricity. There was two people who owned cars in our village, but not having those things, I never missed them, and I did have a happy childhood. All this changed with a dramatic suddenness on a very special day, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from school when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. The effect of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Dub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. I remember the night before that edict went into effect, my mother sewing the yellow stars on our sweater and our outer clothing. By mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in that respect. Our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our three-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall, between 16 to 18 persons at all, whose homes were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tub came during the latter part of June of 1944. On 24-hour notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our homes with no more than one suitcase per person. Three images stand out for me on the day on which we were marched down the main street of Tub to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A relatively small number of them stood on the sidewalk as we were herded by and made jeering comments like, "You Jews are finally getting what is coming to you." The great majority of the town people simply retreated into their homes, closed their shutters to block out the sight of their fellow citizens being driven down the street like cattle. The second recollection was at the local school of all places, on the way to the railroad station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand searched by Nazi thugs. The third recollection was at the brickyard with only a bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman, standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers, was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July 1944, we were loaded into freight cars, between 50 to 60 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding doors of the freight car, which remained locked, mostly locked, throughout the 5-day journey, were opened, there were at least a half a dozen corpses or near corpses in the car, and many more whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, my younger brother, and I, were still together. The first thing that happened as we stood there dazed was an order on the loudspeaker that those in charge of each cattle car, and my father was so designated, were to report to the authorities. So my father left us, and that was the last time we saw him. Next, an announcement was made that males and females should separate because showers would be given. By now, my mother was quite frightened and told my brother and me to stay with her. Being a 12-year-old, I told her I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. My mother didn't argue with me, but left me with the admonition, whatever you do, make sure that you stay with your brother. With those words, she left us, and I never saw her again. Next, all the males were ordered to line up in a single file to be inspected by two German officers. The officers looked at each person as he reached the head of the line, and those who looked able-bodied and fit to work were sent to the right. Those who looked too young or too old or otherwise unfit to work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just over 10, was in front of me in the line, and the Nazi officer, without hesitation, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, and without realizing the consequences of my action, I followed my brother to the left. I was about 2 steps past the Nazi officer when he reached over, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and shoved me to the right. To this day, I do not know whether the Nazi thought I just might be fit or old enough to be put to work, or whether it was simply irritated at my having made my own decision. In any case, that shove from the left to the right made the difference on that day between my ending up in the gas chambers within the hour, as did the rest of my family, or my surviving at least that initial screening process. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months, until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May of 1945, was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first, in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was so because even though I survived that initial screening, I kept flaunting the physicals that prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for permanent work. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me, too young to be selected for work. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. From then on, my battle for survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and almost every other privation known to man. To illustrate, let me give you a brief picture of a typical day at the Mauthausen concentration camp. I will start with bedtime in the evening. Our sleeping accommodations were triple-decker bunk beds, but instead of one person per bed, we were squeezed three, sometimes four persons per bed. The result was horrible overcrowding, with people fighting with each other for every inch of available space. There was no mattress on the bed. Sometimes some filthy ground up straw, often just wooden boards. One night, I offered a deal to my bunkmates. If they let me have the single blanket we were allotted, I would go down and sleep on the floor under the bed and free up some space on the bed. My offer was accepted, and that was a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6:30 in the morning, mostly with shouts, but if we overseers thought that we were not quick enough, then with clubs. Our barracks, housing about 100 men, had two faucets and one three-hole latrine for our sanitary needs. By 7, we had to be outside the barracks and line up for roll call. We had to stand and wait for the German officer to show up and receive the roll call report from the barracks chief. Sometimes the German would not show up for an hour or more, and we had to stand there in rain or snow or bitter cold until he showed up and received the report. This was during the late fall and winter months, and we only had thin, striped prisoner uniforms for clothing. After roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of a brown, lukewarm liquid that they called coffee. After breakfast, the able-bodied prisoners were sent out on work details. Since I was small and frail-looking, I generally was not picked for work. Instead, all of us who were not picked for work had to stay outside in the often freezing cold. To ease our discomfort, we huddled against each other for body warmth. One amusement of the more brutal overseer guards was to start beating the outer layer of this huddled mass with clubs and watch the whole group break into a stampede. In the course of one of these stampedes, my feet got trampled upon, resulting in cold sores that never healed during my time in camps, and I still have the scars today. For lunch, we were served a cup of greasy liquid called soup made out of dried beets, and I hope I won't spoil your appetite for dinner, some dead maggots floating in the liquid. Our dinner consisted of a slice of bread with a square of margarine or a scoop of jam. During my 10 months of imprisonment, I never had a glass of milk or a piece of fruit. The only exception was one day when we were carrying airplane parts on a public street, and a civilian woman was walking ahead of us eating an apple. She looked around furtively to see that there were no guards looking and threw the half eaten apple on the ground. I was the lucky one who picked up the apple, took a bite, and then shared the spoils with my best friend. To add to our misery, the unsanitary conditions resulted in an enormous infestation of lice. We spent much of our days squirming and scratching, and our evenings trying to kill the vermin that were crawling on our clothing. A very large, a very large number of prisoners contracted typhus as a result of the lice, and many of them died of the disease. I too got sick, but fortunately the symptoms did not show up until after I was liberated by the Americans in early May 1945, and I was cared for and recovered in an American Army field hospital. When I woke up after several days of lying unconscious, I was put on a scale, and at the age of 13, I weighed 26 kilos, or about 52 pounds. Following the war, there were many pictures in magazines and newsreels showing the cadaver-like creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation. I was one of them. With all the brutality and deprivation, there were some instances of humanity and selflessness, sometimes from unexpected quarters. Let me give you two examples. The first involved a German soldier who was one of the guards when we were being moved from Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp. The journey was by train in freight cars, but the conditions were not nearly as terrible as those on the trip to Auschwitz that I described earlier. There were about 30 male prisoners per car. We had adequate sanitation and water and meager but regular rations. The guard with us, with his rifle, was quartered with us in the cattle car. During the first day of the 3 days trip, he was distant and unfriendly. By the second day, he unbent a little and for some reason took a liking to me. By that evening, he offered me some morsels from his dinner, which of course was far superior to what prisoners had to eat. Later that evening, he asked me to sing some songs that I remembered from my childhood. I felt that somehow in that cattle car taking me to the next concentration camp, this German soldier and I had formed a bond. The second instance of some light in the dark days of my captivity involved my best friend and me. You could not possibly survive the physical and emotional trauma of the camps without a buddy system, a friend to lean on and give support to, and receive support from. In my case, I found a boy about my age in Mauthausen, and we both felt that we made a good fit. The name of this boy was Simcha, and there's a picture of the two of us in my book, which was taken shortly after the war. By the way, does the school have a copy of my book?
Yes, they do.
One night in the middle of the winter, someone stole Simcha's shoes while we were sleeping. The shoes were not much. They were basically flip-flops with wooden soles, but they were all we had, and they were certainly better than nothing. So the following morning, Simcha had to walk barefoot through the snow and ice to the factory we were working in about a mile away. While at work, the thief, another bigger boy, came up and told to Simcha, "Guess what? I found your shoes, and if you give me your day's ration of bread, you can have them back." Simcha and I knew that he could not possibly survive without his shoes, and neither could he survive without his ration of bread. The only solution was to try to make it for the day with one ration for the two of us. We did this without discussion or question. We both took it for granted that he would do the same for me if it was necessary. People sometimes ask me if there were any good days in the camps. I tell them it was the day I saved my friend's life with a half a slice of bread. A word about our liberation. It happened on May 5, 1945, a couple of days before the end of the war in Europe. We were in makeshift camps as we were being driven on foot ahead of the advancing Americans. For days before, we were hearing increasingly loud artillery explosions that shook the ground. To add to our misery, the weather was terrible and we were mired in freezing mud both outside and inside our leaky and drafty barracks. About the middle of the afternoon, a prisoner rushed into the barracks and yelled, "Hey, the guards are gone." That was the way we found out that we were liberated. What did we do then? Did we do a victory lap and celebrate? The answer is no. Instead, we rushed to the warehouse that stored the maggot ridden ingredients of our daily soup, ripped open the sacks, and crammed a handful of this noxious stuff into our mouths. I spent the first night of my freedom lying in one of the sacks, trying to ignore the lice that were feasting on my flesh and hoping to get some sleep. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am, how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave a new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were thousands of kids like me, hustling for an extra piece of bread. If we were really lucky, some candy or a piece of chewing gum. The only source of those goodies was the American soldiers who were stationed near our camps. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out next to where the Americans were billeted. As I was standing there one day looking for a hustling opportunity, a Jeep drove up loaded with four GIs and their duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the Jeep, headed for the nearest soldier, and with sign language, I offered my services as a porter. He smiled and pointed to one of the bags. The bag was almost as big as I was, and my employer later told me that all he could see was the bag and two bare feet underneath, pumping away with great energy. After I delivered the bag to his room, the soldier gave me a piece of chocolate, which was, in my mind, the object of the whole exercise, and we attempted to make conversation. I didn't speak English at that time. We discovered that our only means of communicating was broken German. I told him about my situation, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, he spent all of his free time with me, taking me to the movies and restaurants, treats I have never had before. We also did a lot of walking and talking. There's a picture in the book of the two of us taken by a street photographer. 5 days later, I met him. The soldier was transferred, but we started corresponding with each other. The upshot of this encounter was that after the soldier returned to the US, was demobilized, and had chance to discuss it with his wife, he wrote me a letter offering to bring me to the US and to have me become part of his family. I gratefully accepted his offer, and in January of 1948, I arrived in the United States at the age of 16 to begin my new life. This is a remarkable story, but even more remarkable is the fact that this GI who befriended me and became my mentor, my lodestar, was none other than Tessa's great grandfather and Miss and Sarah's grandfather. When I started my project of telling my story, my intention wasn't to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story because I realized that I had some obligations to discharge. First and foremost was an obligation to my children. As they grew up, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I subconsciously kept the pain and emotion out of whatever I conveyed to them. I realize now that this was not as much to protect them as to protect myself. I also felt an obligation to the family I lost: my mother, my father, my kid brother, and my extended family. The story of what happened in the Holocaust, how the millions were murdered, has been told many times, but their story has never been told. I felt they deserved that this be done and that it was up to me to do it. I also felt that my story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling. With all the horrors and suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The old truism that often truth is stranger than fiction is, I believe, applicable to several aspects of my story. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe that it does so nevertheless, and it does so at several levels. The most important is the need to avoid hatred, bigotry, and intolerance, and to speak out against these destructive tendencies. Finally, my story carries the message of the resilience of the human spirit and a hope for a better world. Thank you.